Farah Pahlavi's book is called An Enduring Love. In 1959, when she was 21, she married the former Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. During her 20-year reign as empress, she worked to boost women's rights, eradicate illiteracy, and establish a forum for the arts. In 1979, she and her husband were forced to flee their country after the rise of a new Islamic republic led by the Ayatollah Khomeini.
She was one of the most powerful women on earth, a crown worth billions, a palace, an empire. Then it was all ripped away in a single night. But what happened next is what nobody talks about. 2 of her 4 children would not survive. A daughter was found dead in a London hotel room. A son is gone in a Boston apartment.
Well, the first time I met him from close was in Paris when I was a student of architecture, and I was very proud, of course, to have been introduced to him. But really, our real encounter was in Tehran when I returned for summer vacation.
The truth about what exile did to the Pahlavi family is darker than anything the revolution ever put on the news, and almost nobody knows the full story. Until now. On the morning of July 27, 1980, in a military hospital on the outskirts of Cairo, a man who had once ruled over 30 million people took his final breath. He was not surrounded by generals or statesmen. There was no official ceremony, no state apparatus standing by. There was just a room, a bed that did not belong to him, and his wife sitting beside him. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, breathed quickly twice, drew in one long breath, and stopped. He was 60 years old. He had been Shah for 38 years, Emperor for 13, and a fugitive for 18 months before his death. The cancer that had been eating through him for years, a fact hidden from his own allies and kept from him for much of that time, had done what the revolution that drove him from power could not finish quickly or cleanly. His wife, Farah, reached under his pillow and withdrew a small cloth bag. Inside it was a handful of soil from Iran. He had carried it with him through 7 countries across 18 months of exile, from Tehran to Aswan, from Marrakesh to Nassau, from Mexico to New York to Panama, and finally back to Cairo, where a borrowed hospital bed in a borrowed country was where it ended. 2 days later, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt walked behind the coffin personally. It was placed on a gun carriage drawn by 6 horses, draped with the Iranian Imperial flag, and processed for 2 kilometers through the streets of Cairo to the Al-Rifa'i Mosque. Around 100,000 people lined the route. A 21-gun salute rang out across the city. Former President Richard Nixon was present and publicly described America's treatment of the Shah as shameful. King Constantine of Greece attended. But beyond these figures, no sitting head of state besides Sadat was willing to be seen there. The man who had once hosted 60 kings and presidents at the celebrations in Persepolis was buried with almost no one willing to claim him. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment. A funeral in a foreign city, a flag that no longer represented a country in any practical sense, and a small gathering of people who had either lost something alongside him or had come out of personal loyalty rather than political calculation. The absence said more than the presence did. Farah Pahlavi was 41 years old when her husband died. She was now a widow in a palace that had been lent to her by a government that would itself be shaken 1 year later when Sadat was assassinated. She had 4 children. The eldest, Crown Prince Reza, was 19. The second, Princess Farah was 17. The third, Prince Ali Reza, was 14. The youngest, Princess Layla, was 10. None of them had a country to return to. None of them held a passport that led anywhere permanent. There was no indication that any government on earth would welcome them for any length of time before the political inconvenience of their presence became too much to manage. The Shah's story, at least the chapter the world had been watching, was finished. The newspapers had moved on. The hostage crisis in Tehran was consuming all available attention. The Islamic Republic was consolidating its authority. Whatever had been the Pahlavi dynasty was, in every practical and symbolic sense, over. But what followed for Farah was not simply grief and withdrawal. It was 46 more years of life, and those 46 years would cost her more than the revolution itself had. To understand what she was left with after Cairo, it helps to understand what had brought her there and what had been stripped away on the way. The 18 months between January 1979 and July 1980 were not simply a period of political exile. They were a slow and deliberate humiliation conducted across several continents, each leg of the journey slightly more desperate than the last. The Shah and Farah left Tehran on January the 16th. 1979. The departure was framed publicly as a temporary vacation. It was not. The two Royal Guard officers who fell to their knees on the tarmac and tried to kiss the Shah's feet were told to stand up. A Quran was held overhead as the couple boarded their plane. The Shah's statement to journalists that morning was 6 words: "I am tired and need a rest." Farah had taken tranquilizers to hold herself together. She later wrote that her only thought in those moments was whether they would ever return. They would not. Egypt came first. President Sadat received them in Aswan and installed them at the Oberoi Hotel on the Nile. The Shah still believed, or at least told himself, that the situation in Iran might reverse. It did not. Morocco was next. King Hassan II of Morocco hosted them in Marrakesh and then in Rabat, until domestic Islamist pressure and threats associated with Yasser Arafat made it untenable to keep them there. Then the Bahamas, specifically Nassau, where a biopsy confirmed that the cancer that had been quietly managed for years had transformed into something far more aggressive. The diagnosis was no longer the relatively stable lymphoma it had once been described as. It was a large lymphoma. Chemotherapy, which had been administered in secret since 1974 under the cover of an anti-malarial medication, now had to be pursued in earnest. Mexico followed. They rented a villa south of Mexico City while Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller applied pressure on Washington to allow the Shah entry into the United States for treatment. On October 22, 1979, he was admitted to New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. His gallbladder was removed. He received radiation therapy at Memorial's. Sloan Kettering. 13 days after his arrival, Iranian militants seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. They would hold them for 444 days. The Shah's presence in the United States had become the trigger point. He was moved to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. Panama came 6th. He was hosted by Omar Torrijos on the island of Contadora, while Iran filed a formal extradition request. The Shah refused surgery there and fled again, back to Egypt, in March 1980. Sadat took them back when no one else would. The Houston surgeon Dr. Michael DeBakey performed a splenectomy on March 28th. The spleen that was removed weighed close to 2,000 grams and was riddled with tumors. There was a brief discharge to Kobe Palace, then a rapid deterioration. Pneumonia. A pleural effusion. Rehospitalization in late June. On the night of July 26th, he slipped into a coma following massive internal bleeding caused by an abscess in his pancreas. He received 11 units of blood and briefly regained consciousness, enough to speak with his family one last time. Then, on the morning of July 27th, Farah withdrew the soil from under his pillow, and the 18-month journey through 7 countries reached its end in a Cairo hospital room. What she was left with, in practical terms, was the following: a family of 5 with no country of origin, no permanent base, no clear indication of where they would be permitted to settle, and 4 children who had spent the last year and a half watching their father decline across multiple continents while a revolution dismantled everything their family's name had stood for. The eldest was nearly an adult. The youngest was still in primary school. The Shah's story had a clear endpoint: the revolution, the exile, the death, a narrative with a shape. Farah did not. What came after Cairo was longer, quieter, and in some ways harder to account for, because it unfolded over decades rather than months. 2 of her 4 children would not survive. One daughter would be found dead in a London hotel room at 31. One son would die in his Boston apartment at 44. She would bury a husband, a daughter, and a son before she turned 73. And she would keep going. That is where the story of Farah Pahlavi actually begins. Farah Diba was born on October 14th, 1938, in Tehran. She was the only child of Captains Sohrab Diba and Farida Gotbi. Her father had graduated from Saint-Cyr, the French military academy, held a law degree from the Sorbonne, and served as an officer in the Imperial Iranian armed forces. His own father before him had been the Persian ambassador to the Romanov court in St. Petersburg. The family occupied a particular position in Iranian society: upper class, educated, and deeply francophone, part of a specific layer of the Tehran elite that moved between Iran and Paris with an ease that set them apart from almost everyone around them. That world came apart when Farah was 9 years old. Captain Diba died in 1948, and this son. Financial stability that had come with his position went with him. The family moved out of a large villa in northern Tehran and into a shared apartment with one of her mother's brothers. What Farah Diba lost in money, she appears to have replaced with structure and determination. She enrolled her daughter in the best schools she could find. First the Pietro della Valle Italian School, then the Jeanne d'Arc School run by French nuns, and finally the Lycée Rassi, a Persian-French high school where Farah earned her baccalaureate and captained the basketball team. She was tall, athletic, and academically serious, raised by a single mother who treated education as the most reliable thing she could pass on to her child. In 1957, at the age of 18, Farah left for Paris. She enrolled at the École Spéciale d'Architecture on Boulevard Raspail and studied under the architect Albert Besson. She lived at the Cité Universitaire, the large international student residence on the southern edge of the city. A young Iranian woman studying architecture in Paris in the late 1950s was genuinely unusual. She was not from a wealthy family. She had no connection to the Iranian court. She was a fatherless girl from Tehran who had a talent for drawing buildings and a mother who had made sure she was equipped to look after herself. The self-reliance she had developed since the age of 9, the composure, the discipline, the ability to function under reduced circumstances would later be read by the outside world as something else entirely. People would look at her and see the bearing of royalty. It was not that. It was something more practical. It was the result of having had very little margin for error from an early age, and of having learned quite young that falling apart was not an option available to her. In 1959, the Shah of Iran visited Paris as part of his regular practice of meeting Iranian students studying abroad. At a reception held at the Iranian embassy, Farah Diba was introduced to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was 40 years old and had been married twice before. His first marriage to Princess Fawzia of Egypt had ended in divorce in 1948. His second marriage to Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari had ended in 1958 for one specific reason. She had not been able to produce a male heir. The constitutional requirement for succession meant that the Shah needed a son, and 2 marriages had not delivered one. The introduction at the embassy was not a coincidence. It had been arranged by Ardashir Zahedi, the Shah's son-in-law, and endorsed by Princess Shahnaz, the Shah's own daughter from his first marriage, who was 19 at the time. Farah returned to Tehran in the summer of 1959. A carefully managed courtship followed. The engagement was agreed privately in November and announced officially on December 1st. 20 days later, on December the 21st, 1959, they married in the Hall of Mirrors at Golestan Palace in Tehran. Farah's gown was designed by Yves Saint Laurent, who was, at that point, the head designer at the House of Dior. It featured a scoop neck and a matching coat embroidered with Persian motifs in sequins and silver thread, with a fur-lined train. Hidden blue hems had been sewn into the fabric as a traditional good luck charm for the birth of a son. On her head sat the Noor ol Ain diamond tiara, commissioned by the Shah from Harry Winston. It contained 324 stones, pink, yellow, and white diamonds set in platinum, centered on a 60-carat pink diamond from India's Golconda mines, one of the largest pink diamonds in recorded history. The tiara alone weighed approximately 4 kilograms. Farah's mother held the family Quran aloft as her daughter entered the hall. Farah later wrote about the day with a measured kind of wonder. She noted that the Shah was not marrying a princess and was not following the convention of arranged marriages between royal families. He had, she wrote, fallen in love with a little Iranian girl, and like in a fairy tale, he had followed his heart. The architecture student from Boulevard Raspail was now the Queen of Iran. She was 21 years old and had not yet finished her degree. 4 children arrived in the following 11 years. Crown Prince Reza on October 31st, 1960. Princess Farahnaz on March 12th, 1963. Prince Ali Reza on April 28th, 1966. Princess Layla on March 27th, 1970. But the defining ceremonial moment of Farah's life came between the second and third children on October 26th, 1967, the Shah's 48th birthday, when Farah was crowned Shah Banu of Iran in the Grand Hall of Golestan Palace. It was the first time an empress had been crowned in Iran since the Sasanian empresses Boran and Azarmidokht in approximately 630 AD a gap of roughly 1,337 years. The Shah had deliberately delayed his own coronation for 26 years after coming to power in 1941, saying publicly that he would wait until Iran had modernized enough to justify the ceremony. The crown created for Farah was designed by Van Cleef and Arpels in Paris. Pierre Arpels personally oversaw the project, which had been selected from among 50 proposals submitted by jewelers from around the world. Because Iranian law prohibited crown jewels from leaving the country, Arpels made 24 separate trips to Tehran and set up a temporary workshop inside the National Treasury Vault in order to complete the work. The finished crown contained 1,541 stones, 469 diamonds, 36 emeralds, 36 rubies, 2 spinels, and 105 pearls, centered on a magnificent emerald of approximately 92 carats. It weighed nearly 2 kilograms. 6-year-old Crown Prince Reza entered the hall first and sat to the left of the peacock throne. Farah followed in a long white satin gown with a 20-foot train, designed by Marc Bohan at Dior. The Shah crowned himself with the Pahlavi crown, then placed the Van Cleef and Arpels crown on Farah's head, a gesture that was deliberately intended to echo Napoleon crowning Josephine. She then put on an emerald green velvet coronation robe with a 26-foot train embroidered with the Pahlavi coat of arms in gold, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. A 101-gun salute shook the palace windows. The couple then processed through Tehran in a replica Habsburg coronation carriage drawn by white Hungarian horses. A constitutional amendment passed just before the ceremony established that the Shah Banu would serve as regent if the Shah died before the Crown Prince turned 20. No consort in Iranian history had ever held that authority. It was, by any measure, the highest point of Farah's public life. What she built in the years that followed is worth understanding on its own terms, separate from the politics that eventually brought everything down. Farah became the regime's most ambitious cultural architect, and the scale of what she created was genuinely significant. On October 14, 1977, her 39th birthday, she inaugurated the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. The building had been designed by her cousin Farah Diba, a spiral structure sunk into the earth that drew comparisons to the Guggenheim. Inside it, assembled under curators David Galloway and Donna Stein, was a collection of Western and Iranian modern art that became one of the most valuable holdings of its kind anywhere in the world. The collection included approximately 30 paintings by Picasso, Jackson Pollock's mural on Indian red ground, now estimated at around $250 million. 2 large-scale paintings by Mark Rothko, valued at between $100 and $200 million each. A Francis Bacon triptych worth approximately $75 million. More than 15 works by Andy Warhol, paintings by Claude Monet, Paul Gauguin, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, René Magritte, Joan Miro, Max Ernst, Marc Chagall, Edvard Munch, and sculptures by Henry Moore. The total collection has been valued at somewhere between $3 and $12 billion, depending on the estimate. At the opening, United States Vice President Nelson Rockefeller described it as one of the most beautiful museums in the world. Beyond the museum, Farah served as patron of 12 artistic institutions and oversaw 26 educational, health, and cultural organizations. She founded Farah Pahlavi University, later renamed Al-Zahra University, which became Iran's first American-style university exclusively for women. She created the Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, building children's libraries in cities and villages across the country. She established organizations focused on blood transfusion, child protection, and family welfare, and became the first woman in a Muslim country to publicly donate blood. These were not symbolic gestures. The institutions she built were designed with the intention of lasting beyond her. They did last, just not in the way she had planned. When the revolution came in 1979, the museum collection was locked in its vault. The last director secured the works and had Revolutionary Guards sign an inventory before leaving. A Warhol portrait of Farah was slashed. A sculpture was destroyed on the grounds of being un-Islamic, but the vast majority of the collection survived. Billions of dollars in Western art sat in a vault beneath a building designed by Farah's own cousin, untouched and unseen by the woman who had assembled it for nearly half a century. In November 2024, the Islamic Republic opened an exhibition of 120 Western masterpieces from the collection. Iranian citizens queued to see the Pollocks and Rothkos that an empress had bought for them 47 years earlier. Farah, watching from Paris, said that when she heard about it, she had tears in her eyes. The crown she wore on October the 26th, 1967, still sits behind glass in the Treasury of National Jewels in the basement of the Central Bank of Iran. It serves, along with the rest of the collection, as collateral backing for Iran's national currency. The woman who wore it has not seen it since she left the country on January the 16th, 1979. Almost nobody knew. That is perhaps the most striking detail about the years leading up to the revolution. The Shah of Iran had been receiving treatment for cancer since 1974, and the people closest to him, his allies, his government, and for a significant period even his own wife, had been kept in the dark about the true nature of his condition. In May 1974, two French physicians, Professor Jean Bernard and Dr. Georges Flandrin, flew in secret to Tehran and diagnosed the Shah with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, later reclassified as Waldenström's macroglobulinemia, an indolent form of lymphoma. The diagnosis was deliberately concealed. Even the Shah himself was initially told only that he had a minor blood condition. The chemotherapy drug he was given, chlorambucil, was disguised in containers labelled as an anti-malarial medication called quinacrine. Dr. Flandrin made 39 secret visits to Tehran to administer treatment over the following years. Farah was not informed for approximately 3 years, learning the truth only in the spring of 1977. The CIA and the United States State Department remained unaware of the severity of his condition until 1979. The King of Kings was dying and his wife did not know, and his closest allies did not know, and the revolution that was gathering force outside the palace walls did not know either. Whether the hidden illness affected the Shah's ability to govern in the years that followed is a question historians have debated at length. What is clear is that the cancer treatment caused progressive fatigue and weight loss, and that his decision-making in the critical period of 1977 and 1978 was inconsistent in ways that those around him noticed. He alternated between periods of apparent resolve and long stretches of passivity at moments that required clear direction. Whether this was the illness, the medication, or simply the paralysis of a man watching something enormous collapse around him is difficult to say with certainty. Possibly it was all three. The revolution did not arrive suddenly. It built across 1977 and accelerated through 1978 in a series of events that steadily narrowed the Shah's options. Strikes, protests, and demonstrations grew in size and frequency. The opposition was not a single unified movement. It was a coalition of forces, secular nationalists, leftists, and Islamists, held together by a shared desire to remove the Shah and divided on almost everything else. But from exile in Najaf and then in Paris, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini provided a focal point around which the opposition could organize. On August 19, 1978, a fire at the Cinema Rex in Ibadan killed 477 people. The doors had been locked from the outside. The Shah's government was widely blamed, though the full circumstances remained contested. The fire galvanized public fury in a way that previous events had not. 3 weeks later, on September 8th, in what became known as Black Friday, security forces opened fire on demonstrators in Jaleh Square in Tehran. The official death toll was 64. Opposition estimates were considerably higher. The shootings removed whatever remained of the possibility of a negotiated resolution. After Black Friday, the question was no longer whether the Shah would stay, but how long it would take for him to go. By December 1978, demonstrations involving an estimated 17 million people were taking place across the country. On January 4, 1979, in what was described as a last attempt to stabilize the situation, the Shah appointed Shapur Bakhtiar as Prime Minister. It was a gesture that satisfied almost no one. 12 days later, it was over. January 16th, 1979, Mehrabad Airport, Tehran. The departure was framed publicly as a temporary vacation. It was not, and almost everyone present understood that. A small group of loyalists, court figures, and journalists had gathered on the tarmac. 2 Royal Guard officers fell to their knees and attempted to kiss the Shah's feet. He told them to stand. A Quran was held overhead as a canopy as the couple mounted the steps to their Boeing jet, which the Shah piloted himself. He was wearing a dark suit and winter coat. Farah wore a fur hat and collar. She had taken tranquilizers before leaving the palace to hold herself together enough to get through the departure without breaking down in public. The Shah's statement to reporters was 6 words long: "I am tired and need a rest." Farah later wrote that she would never forget the tears in the Shah's eyes as they stood on that runway. Her only thought, she said, was whether it was the last time or whether they would ever return. Before boarding, the Shah turned to Bakhtiar. "I give Iran into your care," he said. "Yours and God's." Within hours of the plane leaving Iranian airspace, statues of the Pahlavi family were being torn down across the country. Newspaper headlines carried 2 words: "The Shah is gone." On February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran from Paris. He was greeted by crowds that some estimates placed in the millions. By February 11th, the revolution was complete. The Pahlavi dynasty, which had ruled Iran across 2 generations for 54 years, was finished. What followed for the Shah and Farah was an 18-month passage through 7 countries, each one a smaller room than the last, as the Shah's health continued to decline and the world's governments quietly calculated the cost of being seen to offer them anything permanent. Egypt came first. President Sadat met them at Aswan and installed them at the Oberoi Hotel on the Nile. The Shah still appeared to believe, or to want to believe, that the situation might shift. It did not. Morocco was next. King Hassan II hosted them first in Marrakesh and then in Rabat, until a combination of domestic Islamist pressure and threats attributed to Yasser Arafat made it politically impossible for Hassan to keep them there any longer. He asked them to leave. The Bahamas came third. They settled on Paradise Island in Nassau, and it was here that a lymph node biopsy confirmed what the French physicians had been managing quietly for 5 years. The cancer had changed. It was no longer the relatively stable condition that had been treated with disguised chemotherapy tablets. It had transformed into large cell lymphoma, a considerably more aggressive disease. Treatment had to become more serious, more visible, and more difficult to conceal. Mexico was fourth. They rented a villa in Cuernavaca, south of Mexico City, while Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller lobbied Washington to allow the Shah entry into the United States for medical treatment. The Shah's condition was deteriorating. He had developed a fever, jaundice, and was losing weight at a rate that made the severity of his situation impossible to disguise. On October the 22nd, 1979, the Shah was admitted to New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. His gallbladder was removed. He received radiation therapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Then, 13 days after his arrival, on November 4th, Iranian militants stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. They would be held for 444 days. The Shah's presence on American soil had become the justification for the seizure. He was moved to Lackland Air Force Base near San Antonio, Texas, and the United States government made clear that it could not continue to host him. Panama came sixth. He was housed on the island of Contadora by the strongman Omar Torrijos, while Iran filed a formal extradition request with the Panamanian government. The Shah was told he would need surgery in Panama. He refused. His doctors, his family, and those around him believed the conditions there were not safe enough to risk it. On March 23, 1980, he left Panama and flew back to Egypt, back to the one man who had consistently been willing to receive him when no one else was. Sadat took them back without hesitation. The Shah was rushed to Mahdi Military Hospital on March 28th. The Houston surgeon, Dr. Michael DeBakey, performed a splenectomy. The spleen that was removed weighed close to 2,000 grams and was riddled with tumors. There was a brief period at Kube Palace after the surgery, a window that looked briefly like it might represent some form of stabilization, but it did not hold. Pneumonia developed, then a pleural effusion. He was re-hospitalized on June 27th. On the night of July 26th, he slipped into a coma following massive internal bleeding caused by an abscess in his pancreas. He received 11 units of blood and briefly, remarkably, regained consciousness. It was enough for him to speak with his family one final time. Then, on the morning of July 27, 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi breathed quickly twice, drew in one long breath, and stopped. He was 60 years old. He had spent the last 18 months of his life moving between countries that did not want him, declining in stages so visible and so humiliating that it was difficult to reconcile with the image of the man who had stood on the steps of Persepolis 9 years earlier and declared himself the heir to 2,500 years of Persian civilization. Farah reached under his pillow and withdrew the small cloth bag of Iranian soil that he had carried with him through every country, every hotel room, every hospital ward since the day they left Tehran. She had watched him carry it from Egypt to Morocco, to the Bahamas, to Mexico, to New York, to Texas, to Panama, and back to Cairo. It had been, in some quiet and private way, the one constant in an 18-month period that had offered almost no constants at all. The soil was from a country he had not seen for 18 months and would never see again. The bag was in his wife's hands now, and whatever came next was hers alone to carry. After Anwar Sadat was assassinated in October 1981, the arrangement that had kept Farah and her children in Cairo came to an end. President Reagan offered her entry into the United States, and she accepted. The family settled first in Williamstown, Massachusetts, then later in Greenwich, Connecticut, and eventually Potomac, Maryland, to be closer to Reza and his family. Farah also maintained an apartment in Paris overlooking the Seine. The daily reality of exile was not dramatic. It was administrative and quiet. It meant managing what remained of the family's resources, giving carefully considered interviews, visiting the Shah's tomb in Cairo once a year without fail, and keeping the household together with the same discipline she had been practicing since her mother moved them into a shared apartment in Tehran. After her father died in 1948, she never remarried. She said the memory of her husband was still too present. She felt, she said, that she was now married to her purpose, which was to see Iran free. But the exile took 2 of her 4 children, and it took them slowly and then all at once. Princess Layla was 9 years old when the family left Tehran. She studied literature and philosophy at Brown University, spoke 5 languages, and modeled for Valentino. But she had never been able to reconcile the life she had been born into with the one she was actually living. Anorexia began in her teens. Depression deepened year by year. A dependency on prescription sleeping pills developed that her doctors could not resolve. On June 10, 2001, she was found dead in a room at the Leonard Hotel in London. The autopsy found more than 5 times the lethal dose of a barbiturate in her system. She was 31 years old. In one of her last interviews conducted at the same hotel the previous year, she had said something that stayed with everyone who read it. "I remain as Iranian as if I had never left home." Farah later wrote a single sentence that contained the entire weight of what had happened. She wrote that it is said she can help a whole community expelled from its homeland, yet she was not able to come to the aid of her own daughter. 9.5 years passed. Then the second blow came. Prince Ali Reza was the scholar of the 4 children. He earned a degree from Princeton, a master's from Columbia, and was pursuing a doctorate in ancient Iranian philology at Harvard at the time of his death, devoting his academic life to the oldest roots of the civilization he had been expelled from as a child. Layla's death broke something in him that was never repaired. On the night of January 4, 2011, in his apartment in Boston, Ali Reza died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 44 years old. 6 months later, his daughter was born. Her name is Irana Layla Pahlavi, named for the aunt she will never meet. Farah said she could not yet speak about her son's death, but that the birth was a happy event. Something had survived him after all. Farah Pahlavi is 87 years old. She published her memoir in 2004. She maintains an active public presence and continues to speak about Iran's future with a composure built over decades of loss. In January 2026, from her Paris apartment, she gave an interview in front of the pre-revolution flag. For 47 years, she said, she had wished for and waited for Iran's freedom. She felt, deep within her, that her return would come soon. "There is no turning back," she said. In a home outside Washington, her granddaughter Irana Layla Pahlavi is 14 years old and has never seen Iran. The crown her grandmother wore in 1967 sits behind glass in a vault beneath the central bank of Tehran. The empress who wore it sits in Paris, and she is still waiting.